Let's first take a look at the Pacific theater of World War II, where Japan's war machine killed up to 30 million people, most of them civilians. It includes millions of Chinese civilians, POWs, Korean slaves, whole towns wiped out. But it's not just the numbers that are horrific, it's also what they did to people before they killed them. In 1937, Japanese troops rolled into China's capital and unleashed 6 weeks of sadism that we know as the Rape of Nanjing. They held public beheading contests to see who could kill the fastest. Soldiers raped women in front of their families, then carved them open with bayonets. Pregnant mothers were gutted. Infants were thrown in the air and caught on swords. One witness described a girl, no older than 9, raped by more than 20 men in a single night and then impaled with a bamboo spear. Estimates say between 200 and 300,000 people were slaughtered. It was so awful that even Nazis stationed in the city wrote panicked reports back to Berlin begging someone to intervene. I mean, think about that for a moment. And Nanjing wasn't even the worst of it. In northeast China, Japan set up a secret facility called Unit 731. It ran from the mid-1930s to the end of the war. Inside, Japanese scientists, they dissected the victims alive with no anesthesia at different points during the disease to study its progression. They removed organs one by one to see how long a body could keep going. One case involved a frostbite experiment on a 3-day-old infant. Another used POWs to test flamethrowers and grenades. People's arms were frozen and shattered with hammers. Some prisoners were tied to stakes while plague bombs full of infected fleas were dropped overhead. And then, hundreds of thousands of people, mainly Chinese, died from the plague bombs developed by that unit. The lab also used Russians, Koreans, and American POWs as test subjects, and virtually none of them survived. On a broader level, the Japanese military essentially industrialized sexual slavery. Around 200,000 women, mostly Korean and Chinese, were kidnapped or tricked into becoming comfort women. They were raped dozens of times a day, beaten, and worse. There's evidence of teenagers with shattered pelvises, girls who died from infection, suicide, or simple exhaustion. One survivor described being forced to service 40 men in 24 hours. And if you were a soldier captured by the Japanese, the outcome wasn't much better. On the Bataan Death March in 1942, Japanese guards bayoneted anyone who stumbled. Thousands died on the road. Those who made it to prison camps faced starvation, disease, beatings, and slave labor.
Hi, perhaps you recognize me. It's your favorite president.
We will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come.
Anybody in this country doesn't minimize their tax. They want their heads ring.
Socialists don't like ordinary people choosing, or they might not choose socialism.
The answer is might, because I want to do you slowly. I was saved by God to make America great again.
We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
G'day everyone, welcome back to another episode of Commanding the Narrative. My name is Stephen Tripp. Thank you to everyone joining us on this Sunday afternoon. It's a very nice sunny day outside, so a lot of you may be at the beach. But if you are watching this, welcome, and thank you for watching this if you are watching this afterwards as well. If you are watching this live, we want to hear from you in the chat. Please contribute. The best episodes are the ones where we hear from you, the audience. You can ask questions, you can make statements, whatever you want to do. And also the link to StreamYard is in the chat. If you are really feeling up to it, you can call in and ask a question. This is going to be a really interesting episode today because we're delving into something that I don't know a lot about, and hopefully a lot of you don't know a lot about as well. It's a bit of a hidden history, a part of history of World War II, which is interesting because it was such a big part of World War II and so many people were impacted by what happened. But before we get there, I'm going to let you know about how you can follow us. And of course, it's by heading to commandingthenarrative.com. And if you want to keep up to date with everything that we're doing, commandingthenarrative.com is the best place to go. You'll find everything that we're doing, whether it be podcasts or articles or events. It's all up on the website. You can see our previous podcast. We just did the 2025 year in review last week, which looked back at 2025 and also looked at the top 3 best and worst performers from each of our panelists, Adam Zara, Richard Stilson, and also Mr. Sam Bruno. So check that one out. And of course, the top pick there, if you're interested in World War II history, is the conversation that I recently had with Professor Eric Lowe. where we looked at the collapse of the British Empire and how the Americans were involved in that, which was very, very interesting. Of course, you get all the latest articles on the website, some surveys if you want to participate in those as well. And if you want to know who's coming up on the podcast in the coming week, that will be up on the website as well. It's the best place to go if you want to get the newsletter. Hit the sign up button in the top right-hand corner and you'll keep up to date with everything that we are doing. Also, if you want to contribute to Commanding the Narrative, you can head to Buy Me a Coffee and find us there. Throw us a few dollars. It helps to pay for the streaming services, which are very expensive. Also, the website. And most importantly, gives me a very warm and fuzzy feeling inside, knowing that there are good people out there like you guys that want to support us and keep us going, keep us operating, and being able to do this without huge costs over the top of us. And also, I want to bring up, as I always do, Australians for Better Government. We're trying to do a lot of reforms or push for reforms there and get the word out for what we're trying to get across at Australians for Better Government. So check that out at australiansforbetter.com. It's coming up to our year anniversary of Australians for Better Government. It's been a busy year, so check us out and follow us there. And please sign up to be a member. The more members that we have, the more effective our movement will be. So that's all on the Australians for Better Government website. And lastly, I'll just let you know about the Light Australia newspaper. Don't rely on the big media anymore. Head to thelightaustralia.com and you'll get your independent media there. And if you want to sign up to be a distributor, you can also do that and get the Light out to the general public. All right, let's get into it today. We're going to have an interesting discussion again on World War II, but this is going to be the Second Sino-Japanese War, which was between China and Japan, and the atrocities that took place during that conflict. We have Jenny Chan from the Pacific Atrocities Education. She's a co-founder. Let's bring her on. Well, Jenny, welcome to Commanding the Narrative.
Thank you for having me. I think your channel is actually really excellent for people who want to know more than what the mainstream media is telling you. I think I first started following you. I was planning a trip to Sydney, Australia, and then I was trying to see what's happening there. And then your YouTube channel showed up, and I was reading all about this COVID thing. I'm like, wow, this is kind of similar to what is happening to California. And the way you described it, I felt like Australia and California were very similar because the weather is so nice. People go to the beach and, it's such a beautiful place that people ignore all this like government kind of attack on citizens and whatnot. And so so then I gave you a subscribe, and I highly recommend everyone to do the same. And when you first started talking about World War II and whatnot, I'm like, oh wow, maybe I need to hit him up and talk and see if you would have me on the show. So thank you so much for having me.
No, I'm glad that you did contact me because I love learning about World War II. And as I said, this is a part of World War II that I don't know. I have limited knowledge about, but it's just interesting. You there in California. I'm just sitting in my little room here in the northern beaches of Sydney, and you don't know where this podcast go and who it's going to reach. So I guess that's a great thing about podcasting. You can reach people all across the world, and we can have these interesting conversations. But Jenny, let my audience, mainly an Australian audience, we do go to other parts of the world, and America is about 15% of our audience as well, which is interesting. But let us know about who you are and what led you to co-founding Pacific Atrocities Education.
Yeah, so I was actually born in Hong Kong, and I loved anime and manga when I was growing up as a kid, and my grandma would shut it down, or actually there was one episode where she even took my whole box of manga and threw it into the trash. And my grandma was a very frugal woman. So in order for her to have that strong of a reaction, I was thinking like, wow, I don't know what happened to my grandma. Maybe she's just racist. But then she was talking to me about how these Japanese people, turnip heads, she called them, would cause like such pain in her family when she was younger. And for example, during the occupation of Hong Kong, her family had to trade in a lot of their money into military yen and rice rationing coupons. And of course, I was a kid, and that wasn't really going into my head, and so I was just kind of ignoring her. It wasn't until she passed away that I realized that what she was saying is true. Like, I found a whole box of military yen and rice coupons, and I was thinking, like, but then we were also immigrating to the US. So later part of my education was in America, and I never learned about the Japanese invasion, or like Japan was in World War II. I've only learned that America dropped the atomic bomb on Japan. I didn't know what had happened before that. And so it's kind of had a question. And when she passed away, and all of her stuff, and I started researching more into what had happened in the war, and I think what I was able to find were just like The Rising Sun by John Toland, and like The Rape of Nanking. But then I was reading more about it on Wikipedia, and it's interesting because the Rape of Nanking was only about 300,000 people. And if you see, the war had killed 30 million people. So I was thinking that the Rape of Nanking must have been a small thing, because if you look at the number wise, it's only 300,000. And so then what happened to the millions, tens of millions of people? And so then I started digging into more research, and it was at the time that a lot of the documents were starting to be declassified by Dianne Feinstein at the National Archives in the United States National Archives. And so I thought, wow, I should research more into it. I wonder if there's a job out there that I can just be like a researcher. And there was no job out there where I could be a researcher. So I thought, wow, maybe I can start my own nonprofit to research more about what had happened in World War II, and also about what had happened to my grandma, why she was so bitter about the Japanese. And so that's how I ended up co-founding the Pacific Atrocities Education. And lately we have it's been a huge journey, because at first I thought that people just didn't know about it because they didn't want to know, well, because of the lack of research. But then I realized that it's not only the lack of research, it's like a language problem. Like some of these older documents that I reach into, right, like they are in classical Japanese, and after the war people switched to more like katakana and like more Western based kind of Japanese language during the occupation. And then second, there's also like a whole political reason why we don't know about World War II in Asia, because some of the war criminals were then taken out of Sugamo prison and were installed into power in even current day Japanese government. And so there's all kinds of reasons that is not, this part of history is not well taught. And and it's interesting too that like in the last 10 years I've been going back and forth to the National Archive, and I have scanned and digitized over 1 million pages of documents related to World War II in Asia. And what's interesting is that like they're not very neatly like organized. And so, for example, if I'm like chatting with someone at the archive, they're doing like a research about German war crime, then suddenly they will find like 2 or 3 like folders in their currently scanning pages, and then they'll be like, oh yeah, you might want to go take a look at these boxes as well. And so it's just been interesting.
One thing that you said, were you so you said you were educated in America, were you also educated in Hong Kong?
Yes.
So how come there's not a focus in Hong Kong about what happened? I know it was under British occupation for probably a long time when that you were growing up, but there would still be a Chinese influence, I would assume. Is this not taught in China? I mean, you would think that the Chinese would want to at least discuss what happened.
I don't think Hong Kong history classes talk about that much either, because then it was a British colony, and I don't think they talk about history that much, about what had happened. And it's also interesting because that's a great question. It's just not talked about due to a lot of political reasons.
What about in China? Do you know of what's
Recently they talk about it because, well, in China is interesting because the military that was fighting the Japanese are not, it depends on which part of China they were, right? If they were in Nanjing or Chongqing, then they were falling under the KMT, which is today Taiwan. And so then I think it was until like 1990s that they start talking about it, that they say that, oh yeah, we had a united government and whatnot. And so then they started talking about it. But it's like, it's already like 4 decades after the war. So a lot of the people who have gone through the war at that point were starting to die off. And so there's a whole host of political reasons that I didn't realize I was getting into. until I started doing this kind of research.
Yeah, well, that's what I found really interesting. As I said, I have limited knowledge about what happened, but just in the last few days, looking into some of the things that led up to this conflict, I mean, this was really a time of chaos in China. I mean, you had the formation of the Republic of China in 1912, which ended Chinese imperial history. Then you had the Chinese Civil War, which started in August 1927, and that basically went up to December 1949. That was between the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek and then the communists under Mao Zedong. And then you had the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in September 1931, which they set up the puppet state of Manchukuo. And then you had the Second Sino-Japanese War, which began in July 1937. And a lot of historians point to the fact that, hey, World War II didn't begin on September 1st, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. It actually began with this conflict between the Chinese and the Japanese. So this was really a chaotic time. There's a lot of layers of the onion going on in China and a lot of upheaval. I mean, is there anything that you want to touch on in regards to the lead
great.
up to the... Yeah.
I'm so glad you did your homework. Yeah, so that was like the open door policy. I think China was already weak during the Qing dynasty until the modern China, which is 1912. But even before 1912, China was already very weak. It was the Qing dynasty, which is the last dynasty of China, and and Qing dynasty was really when the Manchus ruled the rest of China. In fact, Manchuria was their homeland, and then they incorporated Manchuria into China. Can we pull up a map of China just so then your audience can see how this northeast part of the Manchu people incorporated into China, and it's just and it's really. And in 1912, I would say that China descended into like a warlord era, because that's not what the China that we think of today. Yes, right. On top of North Korea, you see that north area, until Heilongjiang. See that Harbin area? Yes, this is all in the Changchun. That and Shenyang. That's all northeast China, and they were the Manchus until they push down south, and then they incorporated China into their kingdom, and so then the Manchus really conquered China. And what's interesting is that I would say that World War II actually started 10 years before before Pearl Harbor, because when Japanese had conquered Manchuria, in my opinion, that's when World War II started. It's a whole like incident that set off Manchukuo, and they established Manchukuo there, which then they used Manchukuo to establish the base for Unit 731, which was like a biological weapons lab to do human experimentation. And what's interesting, yes.
Yeah, so this is the Japanese occupation.
Yes, north of Korea.
Yeah.
Yes, and Korea was conquered by like 1910, and so they were tortured for 2 decades by the Japanese before the Japanese even took over Manchuria. And what's interesting is that when I was reading through all of this biological weapons documents, the scientists were saying, Ishishiro was saying that, Ishishiro was saying that, oh, we need to have some kind of water device to really clear the water, because during Russo-Japanese War, they were having water issue, and so a lot of the Japanese soldiers got really sick. And what had happened then is that he developed this water filter and he peed into it, and he filtered his own pee into water and then showed it to the emperor and said, well, can I get some funding? And because the emperor was like a hobbyist biologist, he was very into it, and he gave him funding right away. And at first, Ishishiro was doing human experimentation in biology, setting up his own lab in Tokyo. But then he thought that was way too out there. People can find out what he's doing right away. So then he ended up, when Manchuria was conquered, he ended up moving his lab there. He set up shop at a soy sauce factory at first, and then a bunch of people. But then his prisoners escaped, and so he thought, well, you know what? That's still not such a secretive space. So then he moved his whole crew to a whole village, and he took over a village just to set up a biological weapons lab. And he erected 150 buildings, and he had places from dormitory to movie theaters to laboratories for his whole staff. And it was and he was testing biological weapons and whatnot. So it's actually quite an interesting a setup, and he even set up his brother as the security guard to ensure no one gets out. And he was doing that in the mid 1930s. And what's interesting for me is that we recently published the first English book about the Kwantung Army, which started this whole thing of occupation of Manchuria. Because at the time, in 1931, when they were having a false flag attack, they were actually not interested in maybe setting up occupying Manchuria. So Kwantung Army, I think it's on the bottom. Can you, on the very bottom, East Asia, I think, yes, Rise of the Kwantung Army, right there, by Kun Cho. And yeah, we spent a couple of years in the National Archives just looking for documents about the Kwantung Army, and it's such a fascinating topic because I would say that 10 years before Pearl Harbor, they started out this whole thing where they had a false flag attack where they were attacking the railway, and then said that the Chinese people did it. And so then they needed to go and occupy Manchuria just to for security's sake. And at the time, Stimson did not want to acknowledge Manchukuo. So then he was telling all the Wall Street guys to not invest in Manchukuo at all. And then there was a economic czar, Kishi Nobusuke, who then came up with the whole economic plan on how to exploit Manchuria, because it's so rich in resources that they could grab and exploit. And so Kishi Nobusuke, actually after the war, was allegedly class A war criminal, but because Eisenhower needed to fight China after World War II, the Cold War was then very important to the United States, that Kishi made a deal with Eisenhower and kind of escaped justice. And he went from being a war criminal to to becoming prime minister of Japan in 1 decade. And you might know of his grandson. His grandson was the guy who was assassinated a couple of years ago, Shinzo Abe.
Oh, really? I didn't know that part. I know he was assassinated, but I didn't know he was the
Yeah, he
grandson of
was. Yeah, his grandpa actually established the economic policies in Manchuria, which is very interesting to see. Yeah.
Well, I want to get into why a lot of these Japanese figures were let off the hook, essentially. But I guess before we get there, we should paint the picture of what actually happened. And I guess let's start off with the actual, the trigger that led to the Second Sino-Japanese War, which was basically the World War II theater of the China and Japanese conflict. I mean, it all comes down to the Marco Polo Bridge incident, and there's a lot of, some people say that it was a false flag attack from the Japanese side. Other people say it was the communist Chinese that triggered it. What's your view from looking into the history of that incident? What's your feeling of what happened there and how it would all began?
I think Japan was an island nation with continental aspiration. So then the plan actually was to take over China in 6 weeks, but China is really too big of a place to be taken over in 6 weeks. And so they then they went over and started fighting in Shanghai. And Shanghai is when Chiang Kai-shek really put in his effort in arming his troops. He even borrowed yes, this is right after, this is the trigger point of Marco Polo Bridge. And after that, we have Battle of Shanghai, where I think a lot of the fighting actually happened in front of the international press in the international zone, so that Chiang Kai-shek can put up a fight in international media, so then he can raise money for this war. And when I was looking into the archives and also looking into the Battle of Shanghai, a lot of the people were saying that, a lot of the Japanese soldiers were under the impression that they can take over Shanghai in 2 weeks. But then I think they ended up spending months there and suffering a lot too on their side. And if you look into Battle of Shanghai, you can see a bunch of the troops were all in German outfit, uniform, and they even used what do you call it? Gas masks. They had mustard masks. They were really putting on a good show in Battle of Shanghai because they wanted international press, so then Chiang Kai-shek can raise international money to fight war with Japan. Ended up holding down Shanghai for 3 months, and because the Japanese thought they could take it over in 2 weeks, and it ended up having been 3 months. So by the time they got to Nanjing, they were very pissed off, and so that's when the rape of Nanking happened, just out of anger, and they killed 300,000 people in the rape of Nanking in 6 weeks. And what's interesting too, is that, and you can see that in a lot of the wars, the Japanese think that when they take over a capital, maybe they can take over the whole place. But you can see from Manila and other places, in China, for example, they took over Nanking, but then Chiang Kai-shek simply just moved his capital from Nanjing to what do you call it? To Chongqing, and Japan was then bombing Chongqing I think at least 250 times, and they never surrendered. And so it's just very interesting to see human resilience at this point of the war.
But the brutality as well. I mean, even Australian history is intertwined with what happened with the Japanese, because we were fighting the Japanese and the invasion of Singapore. There's atrocities that happened there. For example, where I had it here, the Singapore Alexandria Hospital massacre, where the Japanese went in and they were bayoneting injured soldiers. I mean, there was even one incident where there was a soldier on the operating table under anesthesia, and they just bayoneted him, and they killed all the hospital staff, and they just came in completely brutalized everyone. I mean, a lot of the, I guess, Western countries were under the impression that they would just be taken as prisoner of war, and that was the procedure, but not with the Japanese. And even another incident was this one here that happened. Obviously people fleeing Singapore, and these included some of the nurses. And at Banker Island, the Japanese gunned down some of the female nurses, just massacred them in the water there. So that's a little bit of Australian history when it comes to
and it's so interesting because, like, during Russo-Japanese War, the Russians were like, "Oh, the Japanese treat us so well," and whatnot. And so then when you look into, like, from Russo-Japanese War to like Second World War, you're thinking like, what changed? And I am guessing that what changed was that they went into China, and it was so brutal that they kind of saw Chinese people as like an inferior, and then they got so used to being so brutal that when they go to like Singapore and whatnot, they also exerted that brutality there too. And also I was reading on like New Guinea that they were going to fight until the last man. And so then when the POWs were surrendering, some of the lower level Japanese guys were like, why are these people surrendering? Why are they so cowardly? So then they end up having be exerting their brutality over there. And like, this is a probably, I think for your audience is okay. I was reading about the atomic bomb casualty, and it was very staggering to me that like 2 atomic bombs were basically 6 weeks of brutality of rape of Nanjing. But if you think about it, the atomic bomb was like, 1 bomb and like it killed a bunch of people. And for rape of Nanjing, they were really bayoneting and like killing people with like, it was like a one-on-one kind of situation. You know what I mean? Like, it's more brutal to exert that kind of force and kill that many people in 6 weeks versus like a bomb or 2 bombs.
Well, you were talking about the rape of Nanjing before, and you said 300,000 people were killed, and that wasn't that many. I mean, that is a lot of people. I mean, and to kill that many people
using bayonets and swords, and they were having killing contests. It's just it's just very brutal. And that's why I'm saying that, like, it's so fascinating that they can do that with that kind of, I would say, like, Stone Age way of killing versus like bombing. And that also goes back to like Unit 731. I want to go back to that a little bit, because when the scientist was Ishishiro was coming up with this idea of developing doing human experimentation and using germs as like a warfare kind of thing, as to kind of weaponize germs. He thought that, wow, Geneva Convention was so brutal that if these Europeans need to come up with rules of law for germs, I might as well harness using germs as warfare. And so then they signed the Geneva Convention, but then they never ratified it in their government. And so then that's why I think they were okay with doing human experimentation, and also with basically using germs, weaponizing germs. And because there was no survivor that left, and it's so hard to keep track of like how many people even died at Unit 731, because they would start the human experimentation from 0, and then they'll count up to 1,000, and then they would start from 0 again to 1,000, and it was like an open secret. And so it wasn't just like in Unit 731 that they were doing this kind of experimentation. It was also like throughout wherever they were occupying. And it's just it's just like unimaginable, because with this whole village that he conquered, that he has established his lab there. He even had this area where he had his own jet, and then he was bombing these victims to test out his germ warfare weapons, to see how people react to like glandular, anthrax, and the plague. And so then these victims would just be tied to a stake, and then they will be bombed by his ceramic bomb with his jet. And at this point, I think he had already dehumanized his victims, and every person was just like a number to this person. Maybe.
Yeah, look, I mean, it was horrific to hear the procedures that were taking place at Unit 731. I mean, they were freezing babies alive, you know, and performing experiments. And there were some babies that were like 3 days old. They were performing experiments on. They were freezing people's hands and then hitting them with a stick just to see how that would break off. And they were removing people's organs one by one to see how long the body could survive. They're exposing people to all sorts of different diseases, hitting them with flamethrowers and different weapons. I mean, this was brutal, graphic, horrific.
And yeah, and it's so interesting that because of Cold War, a lot of these like people escape justice. And I want to go back to like human experimentation and why it's not just Unit 731. Recently, we started uncovering like Yokohama trial, and it's so fascinating because Yokohama trial were for more like class B and class C war criminals, and a lot of them, I was looking at this like nurse testimony about how she was forced to do human experimentation on people, and I thought doctors and nurses had all signed an oath to do no harm. And it was like in 1945 when Americans with their B-29 were bombing Tokyo, and this group of airmen were captured near Kyushu Imperial University. The villagers captured them, and like there was only one there were a couple of survivors out of this whole ordeal. And when those villagers captured them, they went to a university, and I think a few of them thought that they were going to be saved, but then what little did they know that they were going to be used for like a university lecture. And so one of the B-29 American bomber had their organs taken, his lungs taken away from him, and then they were trying to see how long he would live without his lungs. And other like airmen, they were pumping like saline into his body they were trying to pump seawater to see if they can replace seawater, saline with seawater, which is just like, it's very gruesome. And when I think about doctors, I think about like, you know, they do no harm. And I mean, imagine how these airmen must have felt that they were being pushed into like a hospital setting, and then little did they know that they were going to be used as like a college lecture material.
This is the contrast. I mean, the stark contrast, because I mean, there's movies coming out now about the Nuremberg trials, and how the Nazis were put on trials for war crimes, and we hear stories about Joseph Mengele and the concentration camps and things like that. But there were similar things happening in Japan, almost more gruesome things. I mean, there were stories about Nazis being stationed in China and seeing a lot of these atrocities taking place, and they were horrified by what was going on, by what the Japanese did. But there were some trials that took place after the war, but it was almost like Operation Paperclip, where the Americans wanted to take the Japanese doctors and scientists and a lot of these people that were performing these experiments, and they granted them immunity to hand over their research papers after the war. So a lot of these people got off the hook. As you said, a lot of them rose up the ranks of government in Japan, and or did tours of America afterwards. I mean, there was no accountability for these war crimes that took place. I mean, is it fair to say that?
Yeah, I mean, everyone would know who Joseph Mengele is, right?
Yeah.
And if you look into the map of Auschwitz, is not even as big of a scale of Unit 731. And what's interesting is that in Nuremberg trial, a few of the scientists actually faced justice. And but you can't say the same for Unit 731. After the war, Ishishiro took a plane back to Japan, and he faked his own death. And when the CIA found him, he was saying that, hey, look, I have something to trade, but I need to be granted immunity. And he died of like lung cancer in like, I think, well into old age. And his counterparts, a lot like the second man, Naito, became a director of a pharmaceutical company in Japan. And a lot of his Unit 731 scientists lived very well until after the war. And it's interesting because like not a lot of people know about Unit 731. And so recently someone reached out. He was like working at the youth corp at Unit 731 because it was by the end of the war, I think a lot of teenagers had to work at Unit 731 since the adult men were fighting a war. And he wanted to talk, but then his daughter and his wife were saying to him like, hey, we're going to get ostracized by the community if you go out and talk about this too much. And so then he stopped talking about his experiences as well. And when Unit 731 was disbanded and when the Soviets went into Manchuria, what's interesting is that the Japanese started destroying all their documents right away. And there was like basically a 2 weeks gap period until SCAP, until the MacArthur really went in there to see what was happening. And then they sent like three investigators and to see what was happening with Unit 731. And one of the investigators, and this happened in like the span of like a couple of years, and then the investigators came to the conclusion that these are experiments that the West cannot do simply because of human rights, and these are like important research that people need to have access to. And they had like research from like the plague to anthrax and how to make anthrax into powder form. And so they sent like 2 scientists from Fort Detrick to Japan to see if they can make a deal. And the Fort Detrick scientists came to the conclusion, like after 3 years of like dealing with interrogating these scientists and then like trying to figure out what is the best path, to spend a couple $1 million into trading for this research. And they did it, and then became a part of Fort Detrick's research in the United States. And what's interesting is that we have our we started filing FOIA requests because I thought Fort Detrick research must have been interesting. And a lot of the Fort Detrick stuff did look like that were actually declassified, did look a lot like Unit 731. And you probably know of this company Pfizer. Pfizer was also Pfizer was then in like the 1950s had one of the contract to Fort Detrick to do some of the Fort Detrick work that's been trying to that the US government was trying to outsource, which is very interesting. And so then you look into like the whole history and like where a lot of these research material came from, then you come up with this question like, I'm pretty sure a lot of these scientists went into science to do good for humanity. And so then like, where did it all go during the time of war? And also like, I mean, I am not criticizing that they did that kind of deal during the Cold War, but at the same time, like, I mean, what what would be the better way to handle it, right? Because there's all this information that they have already done, like how to cure frostbite. And like, for example, like planes, that's how they figured out how they were putting like victims into these pressure chamber to see what would take until someone exploded when there's like for zero gravity, right? So then like that kind of research, like would you just throw it onto the trash, or would you spend a couple $1 million to get a bargain for this kind of research?
Well, it's happening. I mean, it's all fresh in our mind about the Wuhan lab during COVID, and they couldn't do gain of function research in America, so they just outsourced it to China. I mean, it seems to have, this is the playbook where they can't do it, in Western civilizations because of human rights, as you mentioned. They'll just outsource it to somewhere else. And if the research has already taken place, you can just grab it. But from a Chinese perspective, I mean, obviously these atrocities were inflicted upon their population, and for the Americans to come in and then grant Japan immunity, is there any animosity? Obviously, I'm sure there's animosity towards the Japanese, but is there any animosity towards the Americans for what happened there?
I think so. I don't know. I can't really speak for Chinese people, but I'm pretty sure. I mean, if someone was using, you know, humans as experimentation. And what's interesting is that it's not just the experimentation that was taking place. They were also doing biological warfare on the Chinese civilian population. So, for example, right after Pearl Harbor, a FDR was pissed, and so sent the Doolittle raid to Japan, and the closest airfield back was not going to be America. They took off from Alameda in the United States, but then the closest airfield from Japan at the time during the Doolittle air raid was going to be China. And so then the Doolittle planes did their attack in Japan and then went back to China in an area in Zhejiang province. And then Unit 731 got involved because they wanted revenge on these Chinese villagers who saved these air raiders. And so then they did a anthrax and glandular spray on these people's soil. And so then, like, for decades after the war, these people were having rotten legs while working on their field. And for a while, they didn't know what happened because they didn't realize that the whole land was like kind of ruined by anthrax and glanders. And it wasn't until like 2014 that they figure out skin grafting. And like a little bit before that, in like the 2000s, there was this woman named Wang Shen who spoke Japanese and spoke Chinese and English and brought a lot of these villagers to go to Japanese courts and to fight for like their justice. And so what happened is that Wang Shen then got, and some lawyers got the Japanese government to the court to admit that they did do Unit 731 and they did do biological weapons attack, but they weren't going to pay reparation. So it's like decades of people's like livelihood lost too. So I'm pretty sure there's a lot of anger between these people. And yeah.
Talk to me also about the comfort women, because that's a big part of this story as well. I mean,
Yeah.
the tragedy of war is it's not always the soldiers killing each other, it's the civilians that get in the way, and that includes women and children. So what
Yeah.
can you tell us about the comfort women?
So it's interesting because comfort women is in Korea. I don't know have you been to South Korea?
No, I haven't, no.
So South Korea is super interesting because I went to stay at this Airbnb, and my Airbnb host was going to school in Ewha University, and she was telling me to join her like apparently every Wednesday there is a demonstration protest against the Japanese embassy. by South Koreans. And that's how deep the scar is between the two countries. And what's interesting is that like nowadays in the geopolitical sense, South Korea and Japan are kind of like they should be allied, but because of this like, torture by the Japanese since 1910, the South Koreans can never get over it. And it's not just South Korea too. In China there was also comfort women. I visited some Chinese comfort women in like 2010 and 2015, and a lot of them didn't want to talk about being a comfort woman and being raped by the Japanese soldiers because it's such a taboo topic in Asian culture especially. But this woman was so old that she didn't care to talk about it anymore, and so then she was talking to me about how like she was raped like 10, 15 times by Japanese soldiers. And when Shanxi was surrendered to Japan, they just came and rounded the whole village up, and then they separated the women from the men, and then they got these women into like a comfort station where then they were serving the Japanese soldiers. And by the end of the war, she got pregnant, because that's just what happens after being raped like 10 to 15 times a day. And her mom told her, if you have a kid out of wedlock, you're not going to have a future. And so then she buried the kid in a cave near home. And that's that was the end of that. But like a lot of these women, they would not talk about it until they're like super old, and because it's just something that I guess this kind of like tragedy is just what you talk about when you're like at an old age, just like that Unit 731 Youth Corps guy who didn't want to talk about it until very recently. Is that I think in Asian culture, you kind of just move on and you live with your life until like you're about to die, and then you want to talk about this kind of issues, which has been very interesting, to say the least. So yeah.
So I mean, some of these women were getting raped. I mean, basically, you got a line of soldiers waiting to come through, and I've heard accounts of 40 times in one day by different soldiers. I mean, horrific circumstances. And were a lot of these women killed afterwards, or what happened to them?
It depends. If they were obedient, I think they survive. I read this book by this woman was living in Dutch Indies, Jan, I forgot her last name. And they actually brought like Japanese comfort women with them too, but they were like higher standard than like the local women. And so the local women were for like more the lower common soldiers, and the women were called like amenities. And some of them actually die when they're trying to rebel. And so then that's like, so if they just stay obedient and whatnot, then they survive the war. And it's just interesting too, because then you also see this kind of like racism there, where like if you're Japanese, then you're ranked as a higher ranking of comfort woman, versus like if you're Korean, that's like a mid-tier comfort woman that the Japanese soldiers also brought along, and then the local woman would be like the lowest grade, where it's like for the common soldier. And so that was a little bit interesting in my research.
If you look at the Eastern Front of World War II, I mean, when the Germans went through into Russia, they were committing atrocities, but when the Russians came back, they inflicted atrocities as like a revenge type of thing. Did any of that take place? Did the Chinese have any revenge attacks on the Japanese? Did they get that chance? I know they didn't go into Japan itself, so they weren't faced with the civilian population, but was there any atrocities against the Japanese soldiers that you know of, or was it basically
by the end of the war? Yeah, that's a great question. So by the end of the war, it was actually the Soviets who stormed into Manchuria to liberate China from Japan in like 1945. So the Soviets were going in, and that's when Unit 731 scientists were actually like fleeing. and it wasn't quite like atrocities on their soldiers, because the soldiers had already been going to Operation Ichigo, which is like in the south. And what's interesting is that a lot of the Soviets then started looting the Japanese settlers' homes. And I was reading about how these Japanese settlers were then trapped in Manchuria trying to get back to Japan. And but then they couldn't figure it out how to go back to Japan, and they could not believe that they have lost the war, because they were under the impression from the beginning of the war that they were going to fight into the last man, and the Japanese emperor was not going to surrender. And at that point, like, the Japanese emperor was kind of like their god, and so they were really lost. And so I read one account of the settler being lost in China, but I think she ultimately survived, and the violence on her family was not too bad. And it was just that they lost a lot of physical things that they had.
Mm. When this was all over and Japan was defeated, what happened in China? Obviously, I mean, this is something that we've been investigating on the West. The collapse of the British Empire. What happened to the Western societies after World War II? We asked the question in previous podcasts: did Western civilization end in World War II? Like, did it destroy itself? What happened in China? Because you see the rise of Mao Zedong and the communists come in. The nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek were pushed to Taiwan. Again, more of this upheaval that's taking place. Obviously, a lot of people had died, so that's a big part of your population. Where in some cases the Japanese wiped out whole towns of people. Those towns are not there anymore. They might have been providing trade or whatever it might have been. What impact did all of this have on China, and did it change the direction of China going forward?
I think so. I think it changed a lot of the direction of China, because by 1944, Chiang Kai-shek was still fighting the Japanese. And what's interesting in 1944 was that there was Operation Ichigo, where the Japanese sent a lot of their key personnel to go fight in like southern China, so that they can have a route supply going all the way straight down to Southeast Asia. And Chiang Kai-shek actually lost Operation Ichigo with the Japanese, and that started really, I would say, a lot of the distrust between the Chinese population and also Chiang Kai-shek, because at one point of the war, he even just basically destroyed the dam. So then the whole village was flooded by the flood. And so that was caused by his soldiers, and people saw that. And so then that created a lot of mistrust. And also, I think a lot of the money that was sent to Chiang Kai-shek to fight this war was not spent in the best places. So then, even though that Chiang Kai-shek was, I think at this point of World War II, the U.S. military tossed at least a couple $billions to Chiang Kai-shek. In that value, in those days, that's a lot of money. And he still lost the Civil War. And right after 1945, right after the war with Japan, we assume there's civil war, and that 4 years of fighting, and with all these money that's being tossed to Chiang Kai-shek from the U.S. military, he still lost and had to retreat to Taiwan, which it leads to today's like complex situation in terms of geopolitical situation in Asia. I think a lot of the post-war legacy is still there, right? You still have the South Koreans with the Japanese with high tension. You still have the Taiwan problem, and I didn't realize that that Chen had taken so much from the United States until I was reading into it. And a lot of the US press was calling Chiang Kai-shek the democracy leader, the democratic leader of China, and didn't realize this undercurrent that was going to take over China, which is Mao Zedong. And it's just very interesting how a lot of this post-war legacy is still happening today, where we have this Taiwan tension as well. And yeah, and we actually unpack a lot of this in our YouTube channel, on our YouTube channel, Pacific Front Untold, and James Bradley wrote about it in his book China Mirage, and I talk to him like twice a month on our YouTube about this topic.
Yeah, I just want to point out on your YouTube channel, because I mean, a lot of the clips on there are lengthy. I mean, you go into depth about things, so I couldn't play them on today's episode or interview. But you have a really great YouTube channel, and you have a really great website as well. The research that you've gone into in a lot of this is quite extensive, and I wish I could talk to you longer about a lot of these issues, but we're going to run out of time. But I do encourage everyone to go to your YouTube channel and check out everything that you're doing, and also your website as well, because there's a wealth of knowledge in there that people can learn about a lot of these things. But for you, I mean, you've been doing this for a few years now, and you've gotten a lot of media attention. I've noticed that you've had interviews and different things around, which is really good. But have you found it challenging to get a lot of this information out there? Is there a hunger for people to hear about this, or I mean, what's been your experience so far in trying to get this to the broader community?
That's a great question. I find that if I talk to like a lifestyle blogger or like a Instagrammer, a lot of people don't know about this history. A lot of people don't realize that, Chiang Kai-shek, which was a KMT government who was fighting Japanese, is now the current day Taiwan. A lot of people don't realize that, like the open door policy and also Unit 731. So then I talked to one of the more mainstream media kind of reporter about this issue, and she took like a whole month to write an article, and then call me like a month later, was like, "Oh, I'm so sorry it took this long, but I had to like really verify." She was like, "It was actually very shocking to me that 30 million people died in Asia during World War II." I'm like, "Oh, wow." And so it's very interesting that like it's still a kind of history that people don't really know about. And I think there is some kind of hunger to trying to learn more about World War II in Asia recently, especially in like China and in Korea. Yeah.
How much? I mean, obviously, after the war, we had the two nuclear attacks on Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There's Western guilt that comes along with that. And there's even a lot of Western commentators or historians that say that was a war crime or whatever it might be. Did that provide Japan with a level of sympathy towards them, and it took the focus off the atrocities that they had done during the war? Was that part of that as well?
Yes, I think that was also part of that. And also, I recently found some documents about how like the Yokohama trials, talking about where they were vivisecting airmen. They actually, for one of the airmen, they pretended that he died in a Hiroshima POW camp instead of trying to admit that. So then they were also falsifying a lot of the record from this atomic bomb as well.
Yeah. Okay. Look, I've enjoyed the conversation. As I said, I wish I could talk to you longer, but maybe we can get you back on in the future. But obviously, we're directing people to your website and all your work. But can people sign up to be members, or can they follow you somehow?
Yeah, they can. Yes, they can definitely get on our email list, and also go on our Instagram, Pacific Atrocities EDU. Yes, there we go. And yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Look, thank you, Jenny, for coming on. I mean, I really appreciate it, and it's such a crazy period of human history, World War II, and it's hard to. I mean, it takes years to try and uncover everything that happened. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of focus on the battles and the movements of troops and the big elements of the macro forces, but at the end of the day, there's individual stories that were happening at the same time.
Yes.
And when you take it on an individual level, you have millions and millions of different stories that were taking place. As you're talking about, 31 million people killed in the Asian theater alone. I mean, it's incredible to comprehend that. When you think about Australia, we've got a population of 26 million. That's our whole population and more just wiped out. So
Yes.
it's hard to fathom, and it's hard to process everything that happened during that time. But look, thank you for everything that you do and getting the information out there. And I really appreciate you coming on today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I hope to chat with you soon.
Yeah, definitely. And for everyone out there, I hope you enjoyed this. Obviously, like and subscribe, and head to Jenny's pages as well and follow her there. And head to the website commandingthenarrative.com and share this out. Take the links and share it to people that you might think might be interested about this stuff. World War II is very interesting, and there's a bit of a revisionist history going on at the moment where people are unpacking it and looking at the conflict from different perspectives. So hopefully this adds to that, and you can get this information out there. But for now, we'll see you all next time. Thank you very much. Bye.